When we think of the Middle Ages, we often think of Central Europe. I think of its castles, the jousting, all the cathedrals, etc. But the Middle Ages were much more international than that. So today we're journeying from Baghdad to the deep territory of the Rus, guided by Ahmad Ibn Faḍlān. Welcome aboard the International Express to Book Central. Grab a seat, settle in, and let's get medieval. The medieval text under discussion today is a fascinating travel account, usually called Risāla, by Aḥmad ibn Faḍlān, Ibn al-Abbas, Ibn Rashid, Ibn Hamad. Ahmad ibn Faḍlān was a 10th century Muslim traveler who was born and lived in Baghdad for most of his life. His Risāla was written after he became part of an embassy from the Abbasid Caliph, al-Muqtadir of Baghdad, to the king of the Volga Bulgars. We really don't know anything about Ahmad ibn Faḍlān aside from what he tells us in his Risāla, which isn't much. He is described as an Arab in other sources, and some historical texts have suggested he was a faqih, which means he was an expert in Islamic jurisprudence and faith, which would make sense considering what he does during his journey. But before we get too deep into the background details, let's actually dive into the Risāla itself. Here are the opening lines, and I would just like to apologize in advance if I get any of the name pronunciations wrong throughout this episode. I'm trying, but I don't speak Arabic, so hopefully I get it kind of right. I'm using James E. Montgomery's translation. This is the written account of Ahmad ibn Faḍlān, Ibn al-Abbas, Ibn Rashid, Ibn Hamad, the envoy of al-Muqtadir to the king of the Saqqaliba. His patron was Muhammad ibn Sulaiman. It records his observations in the realm of the Turks, the Khazars, the Rus, the Saqqaliba, the Bashgirt, and other peoples. It also includes reports of their various customs and ways of living, their kings, and many other related matters too. And so, the Risāla, or Risāla probably, starts on the 12th of Safar in the year 309, which by Western reckoning is the 21st of June, 921. That's a very long time ago. A group of travelers set out from Baghdad, the city of peace, towards the upper Volga, where the Volga Bulgars live. The reason for this journey? Good question. Well, the Caliph, al-Muqtadir of Baghdad, had received a missive or a letter from the king of the Volga Bulgars, stating that he had embraced Islam. The king's desire now was to become one of the caliph's emirs, to receive instruction in law and religion, and to also please maybe have some money, so that he could build defenses against the enemies that surrounded him. The caliph, of course, happily grants these desires, and he arranges for a diplomatic mission to make the very long way from Baghdad to the upper Volga. The only reason we know about this journey is because of the Risāla, because Ahmad ibn Faḍlān was one of the members of this mission. This mission is literally not mentioned, I think, in any other literature, so it's very rare that we have this account of it. Now, it was Ibn Faḍlān's responsibility, as he states himself in the text, to present the king once they arrived with the official gifts, funds, letters, etc. So he has a clearly defined goal. With all of that arranged, the group sets out on the 21st of June, and they pass a variety of cities along the way where they occasionally stay for a day or two or maybe longer. Eventually, they kind of reach their first big stop, which is Bukhara, which is now part of Uzbekistan. There, they meet Al-Yahani, the chancellor of the emir, and also the emir himself, Nasr ibn Ahmad, who's apparently still a child. Now, this is where the kind of first trouble occurs, the first signs that this mission is maybe not super straightforward, because the man who was meant to gather the funds for the king by selling one of his lands has not actually yet arrived in Bukhara. He didn't set out with them from Baghdad, but he was meant to meet them there. But it turns out that he was arrested by Christians along the road, but the group doesn't know this. They stay in Bukhara for like 28 days, but eventually they do have to get a move on, with or without the funds for the king. Ibn Faḍlān is kind of worried about this. Everyone else seems to think that this man will just join them along the way, but Ibn Faḍlān's like, this is going to cause trouble later on. Along this way, he's also already kind of picking up on little differences between kind of Baghdad, where he's from, and these different new cities where he's staying. Now, they're also getting warned about the very intense winter that is about to hit, and it is indeed getting colder. So they get to Khwazm, which is a large oasis region bordering the former Aral Sea. And there they meet the emir of that region, and he's kind of wondering why they want to go along with this journey, why they want to enter the realm of the Turks. He doesn't really want to let them go because he says it would be a risk to their lives to continue. And he also kind of thinks that this whole journey is a bit of a scam because, like, why would other peoples be converting? Why would they be trying to get the caliph to send money? So he doesn't really trust it. But they manage to convince him and he lets them go. As a little aside, Ibn Faḍlān tells us that along the way they went through a village and that apparently the people, whenever they spoke there, sounded like frogs because their accents were weird, which is just exactly the kind of judgmental kind of sass that we're going to get throughout this entire travel journey. So by now it is really getting very cold, so much so that the river Yehun, which is I think now the Amudaya, has frozen over. And Ibn Faḍlān says, "We thought the country we were visiting was infernally cold, a portal to the depths of hell. When snow fell, it was accompanied by a wild, howling blizzard." He hates the cold, I think. He's very much not a fan of it because it crops up whenever it gets slightly cold. And it does also inspire him, though, to tell us about local customs, about how the peoples that he's meeting kind of deal with this cold. And one of them is this custom that everyone gets invited in, even beggars, so that they can sit by people's fire, which I think is just a really interesting detail. They stay there for a long time because of the cold. Ibn Faḍlān overheard a story of how 2 merchants and their 12 camels got caught out in the forest without a fire and how they all froze to death. And he's not about that. And he also tells us that when he goes to one of the public baths, by the time he gets back to his house, his beard is an ice block. That's some intense cold. By the time it gets to February, though, the weather turns milder and the river Yehun has melted. So now it's time to get back out there. They get themselves some Turkish camels, who are apparently more suited to the desert than the camels they had, as well as like these fascinating camel skin rafts for crossing rivers. And they will absolutely come back later. Ibn Faḍlān potentially also maybe gets like scammed into buying like loads of clothes because locals keep warning him about how cold the desert actually is, that it's colder than being in the city. And he tells us that he's got so many layers on, he can hardly move on his camel, which is a lot of layers. So they head out again on March 4th and reach an outpost called the Gate of the Turks. From there, they plunge into the desert, which takes, I think, 10 days to cross. They see no one, it's super cold, no one is happy, and there's conversations about religion with his fellow travelers, one of whom asks Ibn Faḍlān basically, like, what is God trying to teach us with this cold? Like, what is the point? And Ibn Faḍlān responds that all the Lord wants is for people to declare that there is no God but God, and maybe it's just, I think, humble up a bit, I guess is the intent behind it. But eventually, they cross the mountains and they reach a Turkic tribe called the Guziya, I think. And Ibn Faḍlān, kind man that he is, refers to them as roaming asses because they pitch and strike their tents kind of wherever they please. And I think he just can't imagine really living like that. They also don't have religion, which is even worse. But the absolute worst thing about them, in his eyes, is that the women of the tribe do not cover themselves up around men. He's confronted, in fact, with, and this is a bit explicit, I guess, but with a vulva during one of their conversations. There's just suddenly genitals in front of him. And the logic behind it, he says, for them is that, according to the tribe, it is better for everything to be seen but not touched, rather than like hidden and available. Love that logic. But hey, let it all out, is what I'm saying. Ibn Faḍlān tells us more about their customs as well, how they provide for strangers, how they deal with the sick, how they live, how they eat. And it's just really interesting to kind of get to know this culture through all the little details that he manages to pick up. As they leave the region of this tribe behind, they are also invited to kind of lodge or stay with a field marshal called Atrak, who provides even more chances to Ibn Faḍlān to give us loads more interesting details about banquets, marriage rites, and kind of hierarchy and all of those things. And it was just a really intriguing kind of couple of scenes there. As they continue their journey, they reach a river and finally they get to use those camel skin rafts. I was quite excited because I did not know what to picture when they first got mentioned. And so here it kind of gets explained. Basically, they have these big camel skin fabrics, and they are spread flat. Then they're put around the saddle and then stretched really tight before being loaded with kind of all the goods that they have that they're carrying with them. And then the people sit on top of that and they kind of float/row across the river while the horses and camels walk alongside them. I'm still not entirely sure what to picture because the things I'm picturing are pretty fantastical, but I love the ingenuity behind it. And this apparently works pretty well because they cross multiple rivers this way without accident until they reach the Yak River, where one raft does capsize and everyone aboard drowns. But apparently that is a very big and intense river. Now, they are about to get into the territory of the Bashgir tribe, who are apparently the wickedest, filthiest, and most ferocious of tribes out there, according to Ibn Faḍlān. He's horrified when he sees one of them pick and then eat a louse from his clothing. But it kind of feels like this tribesman was poking fun at Ibn Faḍlān as well, as if he kind of realized that he was being observed and decided to do something gross just to freak Ibn Faḍlān out. The Bashgir apparently also have very interesting different kinds of worship. Some of them worship this phallus-like deity because, well, they all came from a phallus, so might as well worship it, which interesting. And then other clans worship snakes, fish, or cranes. So we get this kind of real religious diversity and different approaches to culture going on. At this point, they've been on the road for quite a bit and they're only a day and a night away from their goal. And the king has already sent some emissaries over to welcome them. And they officially arrive at the court of the king on the 12th of Muharram, 310, which for us is the 12th of May, 922. So they've been on the road for 325 days, almost a year, and they have covered about 4,800 kilometers, which is just so long. This arrival, of course, turns into something of a ceremony as they unfurl standards, set out gifts, and Ibn Faḍlān gets to read the letter from the caliph and the emirs that they've met along the way. They are called into a private audience with the king's tent, where food is provided, as well as a honey drink, I think called suju. And the Bulgars already have the kind of minbar proclaimed, but Ibn Faḍlān can immediately tell they're doing parts of it wrong. But that's what he's here for. So he kind of immediately is able to provide the king with instructions on how to improve the various calls for prayer and things like that. So everything seems to be going well until 3 days later. See, in his letter, the caliph mentioned that 4,000 dinar, which he wanted to give to the king. So dinar is a currency, which he wanted to give to the king for his defenses. But that is the money that never showed up at the beginning. So they have no money, but the king has been promised money, and now he kind of suspects that they have hidden it away from him. Now, Ibn Faḍlān had warned his companions about this at the beginning, and he's right. The king is mad. And meanwhile, the muezzin is getting the start of the prayers wrong again, and Ibn Faḍlān is repeatedly questioned by the king about the money, and he gets so annoyed, that is, the king kind of gets so annoyed about there not being any money, that he tells the muezzin to kind of ignore what Ibn Faḍlān is teaching him, and it gets to the point that Ibn Faḍlān has to kind of scream at this man to get him to say the prayers right. And now they're kind of stuck in this stalemate, where the king is unhappy with them, Ibn Faḍlān and his companions aren't entirely sure what to do, and the whole atmosphere is just kind of tense. So yeah, but the good thing is that in the middle of the stalemate, Ibn Faḍlān gets to witness loads of marvels in this realm as well. So he tells us about how the sky turns bright red, for example, and that there seem to be voices and soldiers in the clouds. And he's told by the locals that it's just a nightly battle of jinn, so of these like deities or ghosts. And they're very used to it, but to him it's very weird. The nights are also very short now that it's summer, and that doesn't seem to be something he's used to. He also gets to see an absolutely enormous snake, which terrifies him. But Ibn Faḍlān really has an eye for all kinds of details. He tells us about the trees, the nature, the diet of people, how they get their honey, the clothing they wear, where they live, how their huts or houses are constructed. Just so many details which are absolutely fascinating. Some of the people they meet within this realm also receive instruction from him about Islam, but only if they're interested. He doesn't seem to be out to convert anyone. Another thing he's told about, which is very interesting, is a giant of the Gog and Magog who lived in a realm far away across the sea. But one of those giants kind of made it over to this king's realm. And apparently he was so bad to look at that pregnant women miscarried at the sight of him and young boys just straight up died. So the king eventually had to kill him. And he asks Ibn Faḍlān if he wants to see the giant's bones and skull. And Ibn Faḍlān is like, yes, please. That sounds fascinating. And the bones are enormous. And he's just like filled with wonder at this weird sight. Then comes the description of a Rus Ship Burial, for which the Risāla is potentially best known. So Ibn Faḍlān witnesses the arrival of the Rusiyah, who have come to trade. They are apparently perfect physical specimens, but they're entirely covered in tattoos. They give their women kind of neck rings whenever they gain more wealth. And so while they're pretty and sometimes rich, they're also disgusting. Whereas Ibn Faḍlān puts it, they are the filthiest of all God's creatures, hardly washing themselves, constantly having like sex in public and using like dirty water when they do try to wash themselves. A chief has died, and his female slaves are then asked which one would like to die with him. One of them volunteers, which maybe we need to put volunteer between quotation marks there, but a whole ritual begins then. A ship is prepared kind of with quilts and cushions, and a woman called an angel of death appears, and she sews garments for the recently deceased. They remove this chief from his earthly grave, dress him up, and put him on the ship. They add fruits, weaponry, and animal sacrifices to the ship as well. And the slave who said she'd accompany him, meanwhile, kind of gets to drink alcohol every day, but she also seems to be having kind of intercourse with every other person in the tribe. Eventually, on the day itself, the female slave is kind of raised on the hands of men above something that looks like a door frame. And every time she gets lifted, she utters some words. This is done 3 times, and Ibn Faḍlān wants to know what she's saying. And he's told that the first time she's lifted, she says, "Look, I see my father and mother." The second time, she says, "Look, I see all my dead kindred." And the third time and final time, she says, "Look, I see my master seated in the garden. The garden is beautiful and dark green. He is with his men and his retainers. He summons me. Go to him." Now, this description has fascinated scholars for decades at this point. And it is very kind of beautifully imaginative, although technically it's something that Ibn Faḍlān said he witnessed in person. This female slave is then brought onto the boat as well, and the angel of death kills her there. So some of the details of this ritual are a little bit maybe hard to stomach, but again, we're talking about a different time and age. We're talking about something someone maybe observed, and to what extent we can take this as history is very questionable. But we'll get into that a little bit later on. So shortly after this, the Risāla cuts off in the middle of a sentence. So yeah, it's an unfinished text. Sorry to leave you hanging. Or rather, maybe it's not unfinished, but it just hasn't made it to the 21st century in its entirety. And the question just remains, like, what else did Ibn Faḍlān get to see? What other details could he have told us about? How did they make it back to Baghdad? Did they even? And what happened to the money that the king of the Volga Bulgars wanted? We'll never know. On that cliffhanger, let's look at Ahmad ibn Faḍlān and the background to the Risāla a little bit more. So that, in short, is what the Risāla is about. It is a travelogue, and throughout its pages we get to witness how Ibn Faḍlān and his companions traveled across thousands of kilometers, met different peoples, and witnessed different customs. It's fascinating, just for all the details and the insight it provides. The reason the Risāla is quite well known in academic circles is, like I said, largely because of its description of the Rus. Now, the Rus themselves are a difficult and large topic. They are sometimes referred to as the Varangians and are often equated to the Vikings. This is a contentious thought, though. Seriously, this is heavily debated by scholars. I think scholarship has kind of reached a consensus that the Rus started out as Norsemen originating from Sweden, who settled among the river routes between the Baltic and Black Seas between the 9th and 11th centuries. They formed the Kievan Rus state in the 9th century, and their history is central to the national origins of Eastern Europe. They gave their name to Russia and Belarus, for example, and they are incredibly relevant to the history of both Russia and Ukraine. Scholarship kind of falls into two different schools: those who see the medieval Rus as Norsemen, so as Vikings, and those who see them as Eastern Europeans, as the kind of national foundation of Ukraine or Russia. This debate is a little too extensive to get into here because it does need to be done justice, and I also have to admit that I do not have the academic background to kind of properly explain it to you in a responsible way. I would recommend Thorir Hraundal's PhD thesis called The Rus in Arabic Sources, Cultural Contacts and Identity, for a quite extensive overview of this academic debate, but also how the Rus appeared in Arabic sources. I need to say as well that this debate on who the Rus are still plays today in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, so it absolutely is worth reading into, but it's also important to kind of treat it with care. But sticking with the Middle Ages for now, and especially with Risāla, the Rus or Viking ship burial, as described by Ibn Faḍlān, has been incredibly important to Old Norse scholarship because of the contemporary details it provides. The Viking Age lasted roughly until the beginning of the 11th century, but most written Old Norse sources are from the 13th century. Ibn Faḍlān's Risāla is contemporary to the Viking Age, and it's therefore often seen as a more reliable source of information. This is also supported by the fact that Ibn Faḍlān wrote in a way that is quite remarkable. He shares details freely and often without too strong a prejudice. Yes, he'll judge, of course, and he'll share his judgment very freely, but he's not necessarily out there with an agenda, trying to portray peoples in different ways. His mission was not necessarily one of conversion, for example. So while Ibn Faḍlān does provide instruction in Islam, he does so when it's requested, and he does so without force. I think considering all the other details he shares, I think he would have probably stated it quite clearly if his mission was also an act of conversion mission. Because of that, Ibn Faḍlān doesn't have to either depict the Rus as potential Muslims or as enemies. Instead, he can just kind of write about what he sees, bringing in his personal opinions, but not necessarily an imperial agenda. Is his gaze colored by his own background? Of course. But he shows a surprising amount of willingness to kind of learn and understand and take other people into account. So when he witnesses this ship burial, for example, he's quite willing to accept that his own religion's way of burial in the earth would not necessarily work for this other group of people. As someone who works within the Old Norse field, I must say I'm a little bit skeptical about taking this depiction of a burial as something of a template for how Vikings in Iceland and Norway might have operated. The Rus, whoever they exactly are not the same peoples as the farmers of Iceland or the cultural elites in the court of Norway. They are a different people with different customs. It is a fascinating thing to get to witness, though, especially through Ibn Faḍlān's eyes, the angel of death, and this idea of this days-long preparation, and what could this doorway mean? Scholars have loved writing about this, and sometimes they get a little fancy with it, but it is definitely something worth studying and taking into account. I just don't think we can say, yes, this is exactly how the Vikings did it. Now, as I mentioned, the manuscript or the text kind of cuts off in the middle of a sentence. But in fact, until the early 20th century, the Risāla was only known through quotations. used by Yaqut al-Hamawi in his Muham al-Buldan, a work of geography. It was only in 1923, so literally like 100 years ago, that a manuscript was discovered by Zeki Velidi Togan in the Astana Quds Museum in Iran. The manuscript dates to the 13th century, and it's called Ghazawi Library Manuscript 5229, and it consists of 420 pages or 210 folia. The Risāla takes up 30 of those pages, but even there it's not complete. Yaqut claimed that the Risāla copy that he read to base his own work off did also include Ibn Faḍlān's kind of return to Baghdad, but if it did, those pages have been lost. What has been preserved, however, is one of the most fascinating insights into travel in the Middle Ages and how different peoples encountered one another. It must also be said that Baghdad was an absolute center of learning and cultural advancement in the 8th and 9th centuries. It was an absolute, utter intellectual powerhouse, which focused on translation, education, philosophy, medicine, science, and so much more. Baghdad had the Baytul Hikmah, or the House of Wisdom, which had the largest selection apparently of books in the world during the 9th century, and which was also open to non-Muslim scholarship as well. Many classical works were translated in the Middle East during the early Middle Ages, and from there those texts then made their way to Central and Western Europe, assisting kind of those countries, or not countries, they didn't exist, assisting the groups of people there in the flourishing of science and philosophy. Also, many tales from 1001 Night are set in Baghdad during this time, and they give something of an impression of just how flourishing the city was. It was also a huge city with between 1 and 2 million people living there by the 10th century. Just imagine that. 1 or 2 million people living in one city in the Middle Ages already. That's actually very impressive if we consider how small many cities are. While the idea of the Middle Ages, as I said all the way at the beginning, is often very Christian, white, and Western, it is important to not ignore the impact and the role played by the Middle East and the Abbasid Caliphate in particular. On a final note, I have to shamefully admit that I first encountered Ahmad Ibn Faḍlān through a Hollywood wannabe blockbuster. Yes, I'm talking about The 13th Warrior, the 1999 film in which Antonio Banderas played Ahmad Ibn Faḍlān. Some background to this just because it's fascinating, and I'm in the process of writing an article about this film. The 13th Warrior is based on the book Eaters of the Dead by Michael Crichton, he who wrote Jurassic Park, which came out in 1976. Apparently, Crichton once attended a talk by a friend who said that the Old English Beowulf was the most boring thing ever, and Crichton disagreed, thankfully, and said he could make an interesting story out of it. Now, personal note, I think Beowulf is interesting as is, but I'm absolutely open to people adapting it and playing around with it. Having set himself this challenge, Crichton set out to write Eaters of the Dead. And in this novel, we follow Ahmad ibn Faḍlān as he sets out on his journey. Except that rather than going on a diplomatic mission, he's kind of been banished by the Caliph for flirting with someone else's wife. Along this journey, Ibn Faḍlān once again encounters the Northmen, who are exactly as interesting and dirty as the historical Ibn Faḍlān wrote. From there, however, we leave the Risāla behind, and Crichton moves the story into a Beowulf adaptation. His Ibn Faḍlān is drafted into a mission by the Vikings, who need to travel to the aid of a king who's being attacked by an unknown and ancient evil. Here, Ibn Faḍlān gets to know the Northmen and their customs a little bit better, and while remaining a devout Muslim himself, does become a part of their kind of group of retainers, and he helps them to save the day. Eaters of the Dead is a kind of brilliant mishmash of different medieval texts, so between the Risāla and Beowulf, and it's kind of written from the perspective of a fake academic who has discovered a manuscript. Apparently that framework of a fake academic and a fake manuscript worked so well that libraries actually received requests to see the manuscript. While the book is pretty solid, the film based on it, The 13th Warrior, didn't do very well at the box office. Production was a drama, with conflicts between the original director, McTiernan, and Crichton himself, who eventually took over directing. And they fired their composer, and then they brought him back, and they recut the end, and they added scenes, and some storylines kind of finished without any resolution, and it's a little bit messy. I do enjoy the film. Although yeah, not all of it works. The acting is generally solid, however, and Antonio Banderas is a delight, even if he's not a very convincing Iraqi, I think. And it does try to create an image of a more culturally open and friendly Viking masculinity, which is kind of counter to how Viking ideology gets appropriated by the right-wing and nationalist movements these days, so I'm a fan of that. But it was very interesting to get to know Ibn Faḍlān through a film like this, and then through a book like Eaters of the Dead, and to then discover the historical man himself in the Risāla. Risāla itself is a short but fascinating read, which I think is guaranteed to kind of give anyone a new perspective on the Middle Ages. And from there, I'd absolutely recommend giving both Eaters of the Dead and The 30th Warrior a go. Just dive in. Go on a journey. And that's it for today. If you have questions, thoughts on the book, or recommendations or requests for future episodes, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email at bookcentralpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to be informed when new episodes drop. You can find references to the materials used today in the description. Book Central is written and produced by me, and our music is by Scott Buckley. Thank you for joining me today on the International Express to Book Central.